Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this special public briefing hosted by the US-Asia Institute titled The Sri Lanka Crisis, Implications for the Indo-Pacific and US Interests in the Region. For those of you who have attended our other events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the US-Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Anna Bunn. I'm a program assistant of the US-Asia Institute. And for a brief bit of background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. This timely and important briefing aims to provide our audience with an overview of the current situation in Sri Lanka and to provide an understanding of the larger strategic impact in the region. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a quick couple housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to give special thanks to the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible: the Sands, Shein, FedEx, AIG, ConocoPhillips, Walmart, and Fairfield Maxwell. I'd also like to note that in the latter half of the briefing, there will be time for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A function at any time, or you can directly message me in the chat. Moving on to today's program, I'd like to introduce our panel for today's discussion. Ms. Lisa Curtis is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She's a foreign policy and national security expert with over 20 years of service in the US government, including the National Security Council, CIA, State Department, and on Capitol Hill. Her work has centered on US policy towards the Indo-Pacific and South Asia, with a particular focus on US strategic relations, Quad cooperation, counterterrorism, strategy in South and Central Asia, and China's role in the region. We're also joined by Dr. Deepa Ollapally, who is a political scientist specializing in Indian foreign policy, India-China relations, and Asian regional and maritime security. She's a research professor of international affairs and the associate director of the Seeger Center at the Elliott School of George Washington University. She also directs the Rising Powers Initiative, a major research program that tracks and analyzes foreign policy debates in aspiring powers of Asia and Eurasia. You can read the full bios of our speakers in the chat function, or in the program that will be linked in the chat function. And we're so fortunate to be joined by this distinguished panel today. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ollapally for her remarks.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a special pleasure to also share the podium with my good friend, Lisa Curtis. Hello, everyone. Sri Lanka is usually not in the news as it has been for the last several months. And it burst into the scene, obviously, because of the fact that there was an economic and political meltdown at the same time. That's something a little unusual, to have both things happening at the same time. And there are both domestic reasons and international reasons that it got to the place that it's in. And my own sense is that it's going to need changes at both the domestic and in their foreign policies to make sure that it can get out of this mess that it's in. So I'm actually going to start off by talking a bit more about the domestic internal issues, and Lisa will take up the international in US-China and so forth, those issues. So we hope to cover both sides. Right now, we have a situation where in April this year, the Sri Lanka declared default. That was really the height of the crisis, because in a way, no other country had done this except for Pakistan way back in 1997 in Asia. So, this meant that there was literally an economic collapse. And at the same time, you saw the governing group, a political dynasty, a family dynasty that had been pretty much in power since 2005 onwards, crumbling. They had lost support of their base, which was made up a lot of the Sinhala national Buddhist groups. And that's another story as to how those kind of chauvinist tendencies also helped create the situation. But to understand that, let me just say that one of the, just to put things in perspective, one of the key problems with Sri Lanka sliding into this situation was the rising authoritarianism under the Rajapaksa ruling dispensation. which of course was a China-friendly group, a family, which Lisa, I know, will talk about. And so the presidency had become a extremely, it had taken into itself enormous powers. I mean, one of the things about Sri Lanka in the past had been that it was a vibrant democracy. It actually had the highest literacy rates, and it was doing extremely well in human welfare questions in South Asia. And yet here we are today, where it is reeling out of control in every way that you can imagine. One of, apart from the sort of authoritarian tendencies that had gone up and up over the last several decades, in part thanks to the war, the brutal war that was waged in Sri Lanka for a couple of decades that ended in 2009 under the Rajapaksa government's policies of almost, no holds barred kind of approach to that war. That is one of the reasons that they came into power and stayed for such a long time, the kind of victorious victory against the Tamil minority. So that groundswell of support has not fully gone away, in my view, domestically. But clearly, things would have had to come to such a head that it was no longer able to, the government couldn't sustain itself. And that tells you something about how far they came, and in no small part because of economic mismanagement. That's a second point. Along with the political authoritarianism came the economic mismanagement and corruption, because what you had was the Rajapaksa family, brothers, nephews, you had an entire clan in power. And that is going to be something which, in terms of whether it's in the finance ministry or treasury, defense, military, when you control that much power and you can clearly influence the direction in which the economic gains are going to go. And what you had was what I would call a kind of crony capitalism, where, the friends and the family of this group tended to gain. And I think Lisa will talk a bit about Chinese involvement, because since 2009, out of 313 debt-supported projects, 1/3 of it came from China, and very non-transparent. So we know that probably quite a bit of kickbacks was involved in that, just to put it out there bluntly. So now we have a situation where we have a government that is new and in power, but this government under Ranil Wickremesinghe is under also a cloud of suspicion domestically. Lisa and I may present it slightly differently on this case, but I think I want to point out that since I just talked about the economic crisis, where you had, I'm sure you've seen the international media, long queues for just basic essentials, just to get gasoline at the pump. You had to wait 8 to 10 hours to fill the car, and then you couldn't even get it. People were afraid of getting sick. I know people who said that they were worried because there's no medicines to be had. There were, the hospitals were running extremely short. Food items, power cuts. People were in a situation where that had gone to the point where it brought people out to the streets. I mean, it obviously took extreme economic conditions to bring so many people out on the street, and to engage in things like storming the prime minister's residence and setting it on fire. That was something kind of almost unimaginable. And so at the time that this crisis was happening, the current president was actually came in as part of the Rajapaksa ruling dispensation, and it was seen as partly the Rajapaksas trying to bring in a more bring in an outside opposition person to calm the situation down, to show that, they started getting rid of all the cabinet ministers that were part of their family and their cronies. But the fact that the current president was also affiliated with the Rajapaksas as they were on their way down, cast a certain amount of cloud on the current president. But that they were looking for ways out of this political crisis to try to meet some of the demands of the protesters that wanted the entire Rajapaksas out. Because at one point, the brothers, Mahinda Rajapaksa and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, were prime minister and president, respectively. So that was the level of concentration of power at the time. And so when when Ranil Wickremesinghe, the current president, was inducted into the government as first prime minister, he, of course, now that both of the Rajapaksas have left power, or actually forced out of power, I should say, and one brother, Gotabaya, the president, had fled the country under a great deal of had to be very surreptitious, had to get out of there because people wanted him to stay and be held accountable. He managed to get out, but his brother, Mahinda, is still in Sri Lanka and is a member of parliament. So there is still questions about what exactly is going to happen with him. But all that said, we are now in a situation where the Rajapaksas effectively are out of power. At the same time, the political party that they came to power on still has a majority in parliament. And they are the ones that are elected or selected the current the current president. And I should say that the former president, on his way out, appointed Ranil as kind of a last-ditch effort. So you have a situation where, at least for the moment, the political and economic crisis is somewhat stabilized. There's also some promise on the horizon with the International Monetary Fund agreeing to step in with a loan, which is called Extended Facility, which will be giving up to, I think, $4 billion. It comes with certain conditions. And I think that is going to be something we have to watch, because the IMF conditions will put certain austerity measures. And in the past, when countries are in a dire situation economically like this, the IMF demands cuts in subsidies and so forth, that could lead to further protests. So Sri Lanka is certainly not out of the woods yet. And of course, I want to end by saying that, the pandemic certainly had a role to play in the economic crisis. But also Sri Lanka is kind of very much dependent on tourism. That also got obviously hit for about a year and a half. But, many other countries did too. And they've been managing to survive much better than Sri Lanka. So my own view is that I think the domestic corruption, mismanagement, and the role of China, I think, in propping up, if not propping up, but facilitating the continuing rule of this autocratic group, I think had a lot to contribute to where we are today. And the final thing I should say, and I can do this more in Q&A, the role of India. As much as in the actual crisis, what's surprising, in fact, shocking, I would say, is the absence of China. China seems to have sort of left the scene, whereas India has stepped in, where for 15, 20 years, even though it's 30 miles away, it has shockingly been pushed out of its historic regional influence. So there's a lot of regional geopolitical churning going on. And sorry if I took too long, but I'm going to now turn it over to Lisa to maybe talk more about that aspect. Thanks again.
Well, thank you. And thanks to Annabun and the U.S. Asia Institute for inviting me here today. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be on the dais with Deepa, who just gave you a wonderful rundown of the domestic politics at play. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka, China, and U.S. Sri Lanka relations, and kind of what's been happening and what we're looking toward. So certainly the economic and political crisis has brought this small island nation that is located at the maritime crossroads of Asia and the Middle East into the global spotlight. And the United States simply can't afford to ignore Sri Lanka's perils, and it must assist the country in finding its way back to a path of economic and democratic stability, which I think is possible. And, hopefully we're on that path now. Sri Lanka has faced multiple challenges in the last several years, and the U.S.-Sri Lanka relationship has certainly seen some low points, particularly during that period when Mahinda Rajapaksa ruled the country from 2005 to 2015. And I want to spend some time talking about that period in 2015 when the Mahinda Rajapaksa government was replaced by the unity government led by Maithripala Sirisena and Ranil Wickremesinghe. I think that was sort of a golden period. It was a short but golden period where you saw the two sides coming together. They co-sponsored, the Sri Lankan government co-sponsored a UN Human Rights Council resolution acknowledging war crimes happened during, by both the government and the LTTE during the 30-year civil war that ended in 2009. You also saw the US announcing Millennium Challenge Corporation threshold program for Sri Lanka, which never happened, and I'll talk about later. There were also notable constitutional reforms. The Sri Lankan parliament passed Article 19 to curb the powers of the presidency by reinstating a two-term limit to the presidency, limited the president's ability to dissolve parliament, revive the Constitutional Council, and established independent commissions to oversee the judiciary and police. The other notable shift during this time was that Sri Lanka went from a narrowly focused foreign policy orientation toward China back to sort of better balancing its relationships between India and China. And of course, we saw India-Sri Lankan relations really go south in 2014 when Chinese submarines docked twice at Colombo's port. And I bring up this history because I do think it could provide some pointers for where Sri Lanka can head at this particular moment. There are, of course, several contributing factors to the economic crisis that Sri Lanka is facing. We heard from Deepa about the economic mismanagement, which has been happening over a long period of time, the corruption, the nepotism, particularly during Rajapaksa's rule, both Mahinda Rajapaksa's rule, but more recently with Gotabaya Rajapaksa's rule. The collapse in the tourism industry because of the impact of COVID-19. And of course, the energy and food shortages that are now happening because of Russia's war in the Ukraine. So there are multiple factors that have gotten Sri Lanka where it is now. But we cannot discount Sri Lanka's over-reliance on Chinese investment as a significant contributing factor. Former President Mahinda Rajapaksa had made numerous deals with China, most notably, of course, the Hambantota port deal, which the country's leaders ended up extending China a 99-year lease in exchange for $1 billion in debt relief. And according to a 2020 study by the Chatham House, Chinese infrastructure investments in Sri Lanka totaled $12 billion in the period between 2006 and 2019. In addition to the Hambantota port, other projects were, of course, the Colombo Port City, a terminal at the Colombo Port, the International Airport and Convention Center in Hambantota, several expressways, a power station, and the Lotus Tower, which is a largely symbolic landmark that is apparently the tallest self-supporting structure in South Asia. So when the clashes broke out in Colombo in May, which were primarily over rising fuel and food costs and the government's mismanagement of the economy, protesters also pointed to these Chinese white elephant projects as indicative of the gross economic mismanagement of the country, particularly projects like the Hambantota port in the Rajapaksa's hometown, and the unused airport and convention center, which I mentioned earlier. So China is Sri Lanka's third biggest lender, behind the Asian Development Bank and Japan, and accounts for around 10% of Sri Lanka's debt. And of course, the debt servicing shot up dramatically over the last several years. And Sri Lanka got to the point where it owed about $12 billion to private creditors, another $9 billion to multilateral banks, $14 billion to bilateral creditors, including $5 billion to China and $3.5 billion to Japan. So China holds roughly $7 billion of Sri Lanka's total central government debt, mostly through government-owned entities like China Exim Bank and China Development Bank. And these are the loans that have financed many of those white elephant projects that I had just mentioned. So I think Sri Lanka's economic crisis will certainly serve as a cautionary tale for future Belt and Road Initiative recipients. And it's a cautionary tale to perform careful due diligence, demand greater transparency on Chinese lending before major infrastructure deals like this are concluded. And I've just spelled out the Chinese contribution to the crisis, but as Deepa pointed out, China has not been clear about how it might help Sri Lanka get out of this crisis. We're not quite sure what China is going to do moving forward. So far, China has refused Sri Lanka's request to reschedule project loans, and it's not yet committed to joining multilateral debt negotiations. And I would just add that China's plan to send a military ship to Sri Lanka's port city of Hambantota next week, in the midst of all this political and economic turmoil, is a cause for concern. While President Wickremesinghe has said it is there for refueling purposes only, the timing is certainly not ideal. China has said it's a survey ship conducting research in the Indian Ocean, but it will also have advanced technology and satellite capabilities. And of course, this could be used for other strategic purposes. Now, another point I would like to make is on the $400 million MCC grant, and I say grant, not loan funding, that the U.S. had offered Sri Lanka a few years ago, was of course turned down by Gotabaya Rajapaksa government. I worked at the NSC when this happened, and it was, extremely troubling. I think it was a terrible decision for the Sri Lankan people and the Sri Lankan economy. And one has to wonder now whether, if Sri Lanka had agreed to accept this MCC grant funding and the technical assistance and everything that comes with it, would they have been able to avoid this crisis, or at least maybe it would have helped in some way. But at the time, there was such negative propaganda about the MCC grant that it would somehow interfere in Sri Lanka's sovereignty. And I think, we can say that almost certainly this propaganda was driven by the Chinese, who of course wanted to displace US influence in the country. So I think that's just something for consideration now. And I think certainly the United States could have done a better job in countering the Chinese propaganda surrounding the MCC. And that's something that the US government should consider as it moves forward with Sri Lanka now. So in conclusion, I do believe that President Wickremesinghe is the right leader to help guide the nation at this time of crisis. I recognize the association with the Rajapaksas, but at the same time, he is separate. He's a different kind of leader. He's experienced. He has the economic background and knowledge. And he has agreed to meet the Sri Lankan people's demand to abolish the executive presidency. He's talked about the need for the country to come together through the establishment of a multi-party government for a limited period of time until the country can get on firmer ground, both economically and politically. So at least in terms of an interim leader, I think the country could do a lot worse than President Wickremesinghe. I think the point to note is the Sri Lankan protesters have been heard. And it's really time to get down to stabilizing the situation and making sure that the country comes out of this crisis. So that's all I'll say for now, but I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for sharing. I wanted to give Deepa a chance if you'd like to speak a little bit more about your thoughts on the new presidential administration. I know you mentioned perhaps disagreeing a little bit.
Well, I think the way that Lisa has characterized it, I can't really disagree with the fact that there are not that many good alternatives in Sri Lanka right now. And the idea of holding brand new elections right now would be just incredibly disruptive, because it's not going to, that is not going to produce anything in the short order that you need to have some action taken. And so at the same time, I think Ranil Wickremesinghe could have come in on a slightly different note. One of the first things he did was to set the forces, the police, against the protesters outside the secretariat, Parliament Secretariat, to tear down their tents and so forth in a pretty forceful manner in the middle of the night. That his first action probably, got a lot of ill will with the protesters. Now, since then, he has made he's trying to appease them much more, as Lisa said. I think he has his work cut out for him. And he will have to, it's going to be hard to live down the fact that he was associated with them. But if he delivers on the goods, that might be enough to get him out of this mess. He's also, I have to say, a political survivor. This is he's been prime minister, I think, 6 times before, which is the record in Sri Lanka, but most anywhere. So I don't see him going anywhere soon, no matter what. It's been his dream to become the president, I think, and he will stay. But because of that, of his association, he'll have maybe a harder time, but he may be able to negotiate much better with the international lenders, IMF, India. Most of the countries in the region know him, and I think only the Chinese perhaps are not very happy with him, because he has been much more even-handed and maybe even a little tilting toward India and the US. So in that sense, I think he's well placed internationally to get assistance. Domestically, he's going to have a little bit more trouble. But so he has some advantage, some disadvantage.
Thank you. Speaking of the IMF, we have a question from the audience asking if you could discuss the issues in securing an IMF bailout in reference to the talks ending in June without a deal and hopefully the restarting of talks going forward.
Who would like,
I can say a
I-
few words.
yeah, go ahead, and then I can.
Yeah, well, look, I think that, as Deepa said, the IMF, getting the IMF program is very important for Sri Lanka, but there are certain conditions that Sri Lanka will have to meet. And I think given Wickremesinghe's background, economic background, and experience in dealing with the IMF and others, that it is important to get these talks back on track. But of course, there has to be a level of political stability for that to happen. So the hope is that things can settle down, and despite the appearance of somehow being close to the Rajapaksas, which I think we need to look at the whole past of Wickremesinghe, in rather than judging, what just happened over the last couple of months, look at, the whole package and see that he's not the Rajapaksas. So I think that's important. You need that political stability. And the second point is China. What is China going to do? Because, there has to be transparency, there has to be an opening of the books, and there has to be renegotiating the debts, and China, of course, being one of the biggest creditors. So a lot of this does hinge on China and whether or not it's going to cooperate. And as I was saying, I'm not quite sure we know what direction China's heading in. It has, in some cases, restructured its debts with countries. I think it just did some of that with Zambia. So it is possible, but we just don't know for sure what China's going to do.
I will just add on the IMF that the IMF is going to, I think, have to tread a bit carefully here because they're asking for about a 4 billion, as I said, extended facility, which means that you get, as opposed to a standby, which is a short-term credit, which has to be paid back in about 3 years, the extended facility that Sri Lanka is looking for can be paid back anywhere up to 10 years, 12 years. So it gives them much more breathing room. And from what I understand, talking to a couple of people who are involved in the negotiations, the IMF is willing to give the vulnerable populations of the country a certain amount of cash transfers, which is under the discretion of the IMF to do so, to in fact meet the immediate challenges, and perhaps also recognizing that there is a great deal of unrest in the country and people who are in need, which when you can't couple that with austerity measures, which the IMF usually asks for, which is cutting back on subsidies and so forth, which that's going to help hurt the common person. So I think which is why it's taking a long time. You might be wondering, why the heck can't this thing move faster? And there are a lot of details associated with this as well. I also agree with Lisa that the Chinese involvement in this is going to be, how they play this out is going to be critical. So far, when the IMF comes in, they will ask for all the books to be opened. And there's a lot more transparency, which is one of the reasons that Sri Lanka had been avoiding the IMF, because back in 2020, there was some thinking about approaching the IMF because the economic crisis was looming. At that time, the Chinese came in and actually offered an alternative and said, don't go to the IMF. We will give you additional credits, which then, of course, shot up the debt problem again. And just all it did was postpone the day of reckoning. So now I think there's going to be, but again, so I think that is a big question. The other thing I will just quickly point out is that, the IMF, there is some consternation in the West that, and in India too, that if the IMF comes and bails out the Sri Lankans, that the Chinese could be the beneficiaries of that, without having to be that involved in the bailout. That the West, in a sense, might bail out Sri Lanka, and China could benefit from that without having to restructure and do any of their own economic relationships with Sri Lanka. I don't know if that can be held up like this or not, whether they can get away with that. It's not clear, but it would be something to think about.
Thank you. Sort of in the same vein, much of the international assistance offered to Sri Lanka has been given on the condition that they develop more democratic means and values, especially as they sort of restructure their government. How much can we expect Sri Lanka to be able to meet those expectations, and how, if all, can they be measured and enforced?
Can I go? Okay. Well, first of all, I think no money ever is given without some conditions. Okay, nobody's going to get free money, and it never has. That's not the way it works. So one of the things that the Chinese have done very successfully in the past is to give credit without expecting any sort of real governance or certain international standards to be met, and due diligence about the projects and so forth. It was basically funneling in a lot of money, partly as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, to get rid of their own surplus, but also to gain influence in some of these critical, strategically located. I mean, I can't emphasize enough how strategically located Sri Lanka is in the Indian Ocean and in the Indo-Pacific. But so the IMF is going to be looking more in those kinds of, it's going to be asking for a certain amount of restructuring. It's going to ask for a lot of accountability. Not so much, they can't really dictate democratic politics, hold a certain number, elections and so forth, or have open kind of, more tolerant behavior toward the minority or something. But accountability is, I think, the thing that they can push for. And they will, especially because of the past, because you've seen what's happened without accountability. And I think the Sri Lankan people can be brought along if that is emphasized, that you're getting a new accountable creditor in here. Okay. And I think in the same way, I think the Indians, who have been the most forthcoming over the last several months, up to $4 billion has been given by India alone in loans and credits during this crisis. It's been huge, as opposed to 76 million that they've gotten from the Chinese. That's a huge difference. But the Indians are also much more favorable to a democratic governance structure in Sri Lanka. And in that sense, they see Ranil Wickremesinghe as much more in that democratic light than the previous administrations. So, there's no one-to-one correspondence between money and democracy, but I certainly think you can hold them more accountable.
Yeah, I would echo that. There's two levels here. There are some of the changes and reforms to improve the democratic system and sort of overall accountability, reducing the presidential powers, as we had talked about, and just kind of ensuring the country doesn't continue this slide toward authoritarianism that we saw under the Rajapaksas. But I think there is going to be a need for accountability. I mean, the country was, the economy was severely mismanaged. There was a lot of corruption and nepotism, And so the Sri Lankan people are looking for accountability regarding Gotabaya and Mahinda Rajapaksa. So I think, there are sort of two levels here. The institutional reforms, which, could happen under a multi-party unity government. And again, I come back to, in 2015, some of the hopefulness we saw around some of those changes, seeing that kind of thing happen, but also, specific accountability on individuals who may have contributed to getting the country in this crisis.
Similarly, we have a question from the audience about the likelihood of SJB and Sujith getting fully on board with the sort of national all-party program. How feasible is that inclusive cooperation occurring, especially given that SJB was opposed to the new president?
I think there was some view as the protests were gaining in strength and gaining momentum. There was this view that Sajith Premadasa was had emerged as a most popular on the street, if you will, to step in as leader of Sri Lanka. The issue is, though, that within Parliament, the majority still is with the previous government's parliamentarians. And so when they decided to back Ranil, they stepped back, seeing that there was no pathway to gaining power. They stepped back. That said, I think the elections are in a year and a half, I believe, the general elections. And so there's, you can imagine how much campaigning there's going to be in the next several months to put themselves in a position to gain power. So there's nothing to say that they're not going to be contenders down the road. It will depend on how much Ranil is able to accomplish, in the next several months. But so the idea that there's either Rajapaksas or only Rajapaksas or Wickremesinghe is not true, because there are others coming up and we don't really know. And there might be, and I have to say one thing about Ranil is that he is fairly flexible. As I said, political survivor. You could imagine a kind of a national unity government, depending on what the numbers are in Parliament, right? There might be certain coalitions. In the past, back in 2004, 2005, Ranil Wickremesinghe was the opposition leader as prime minister, and you had a president who was from the other party, the SLFP, Chandraga Bandaranaike, and they had what you call a cohabitation governing body. There is some precedence in Sri Lanka for that.
Lisa, do you have anything you want to say?
No, I don't have anything.
Okay.
Thank you.
Another question from the audience: what, if anything, can Congress do to address the situation in Sri Lanka?
Well, of course, hearings are always a good idea. I think holding a hearing, if although I think they're going out of session soon, but that's something that maybe when they come back in the fall could be done. In terms of legislation, I'm not sure that this is a particular time when there's a need for legislation, because really, all the focus is getting the economy back on track. But maybe a resolution, sponsoring a resolution, maybe some visits to the country to show support from Congress, because Sri Lanka is important. We have a long history of good relations. We talked about its strategic location, the fact that China's made a big play for Sri Lanka over the last 15 years. And so it's not a country that we can forget about or ignore. So I think, giving some attention to Sri Lanka, I noticed Secretary Blinken made remarks on Sri Lanka from Cambodia, I think yesterday. I think that's important because I think it's easy for people to dismiss Sri Lanka, unfortunately, and think, oh, it's a small country, it doesn't matter, et cetera. But it does. It's an important country, it's an important location, and not least of which, it's very close to India. It's very important to India, and India also is a major player in our Indo-Pacific strategy and what we're doing in that region. So I think just Congress monitoring the situation, providing some attention to the issues. I think that's important. I'll just have a quick aside here. When I was at the National Security Council, we did develop a Sri Lanka strategy, but it was not easy. They're developing consensus on the issues, particularly when you have a lot of human rights issues, and particularly during the Rajapaksa regime. There were many questions about the treatment of Tamils at the end of the war, et cetera. So there are very strong human rights concerns, and sort of balancing those with the strategic concerns of wanting to, build closer naval and maritime ties with Sri Lanka and closer overall relations. It made for a very, very interesting debate within the U.S. government. We eventually were able to develop a Sri Lanka strategy, and I think it was good, but it was not easy because there are a lot of different interests that people have when it comes to Sri Lanka. But I think this is an opportunity for the U.S. to show its assistance, that it wants to help Sri Lanka out of this time of crisis, and is a dependable and reliable partner for Sri Lanka.
Thank you. I want to turn back a little bit to sort of China's kind of reluctance to offer assistance and how this potentially opens an opportunity for India to become more of an influential player in the region and sort of take back that standing from China.
Yeah, the question of how it is that Sri Lanka sort of slipped into China's grip from about 2004-5 onwards, all the way up to now, is something that I think the Indian foreign policy establishment has never really fully answered. Given the kind of historic ties it had and the lack of ties that China had, and the speed in which the Chinese were able to gain a foothold there is quite surprising in many ways. And I think one of the issues has been that India, I think, has taken the region for granted, some of the smaller countries for granted. They've also been somewhat high-handed in diplomacy in the past, especially of course, in Sri Lanka, India happened to be on the opposite side of the government when they were fighting the Tamil minority, because of the fact that you have a huge Tamil population in India that wanted greater safeguards for the Tamils in Sri Lanka. So it's a very complicated historical baggage that India brings. That said, I think this sort of black swan event that just happened in Sri Lanka has given India the opportunity. It also has shown that for China, perhaps, Sri Lanka is not one of its what I would call core interests. Because the fact that it has not stepped in, as one would expect, and instead, as Lisa pointed out, when it is doing something, it's sending a military vessel that is going to take a couple of weeks to get to Hambantota. what kind of message is that? And it's quite surprising that actually it is even doing that. They really are, in terms of marketing, I think it's just not going to go down well in Sri Lanka and in the region, and to other creditors and other friends of China. So this gives India an opportunity, and it has something called the neighborhood first policy, which it has been trying to promote since 2015. But in the past, it's been mostly just summits, high-level summits, a lot of declarations. Now, there is the opportunity to actually put some funding into it and show actual, it was the first responder. I think one of the things to remember is that in the region, partly because of its location, it is the only one that can be the first responder to humanitarian crisis, to an economic crisis like this. And it has shown up this time. It was the first, way back in February, it gave $16 million immediately. So, and I think I think we are seeing something that can probably sustain itself, in part because, as Lisa said, the United States and Japan and members of the Quad, this could become one of the areas where it is in a supportive role to India, because India is not going to be able to do it alone vis-a-vis China. Its economy is only 1/5 the size of China's. It only spends 1/3 the defense spending of China. So clearly, it doesn't have the same deep pockets. So it will need backing from the United States and other democratic countries.
Yeah, I do want to add something here. Look, I think in a way, this is a classic case of Chinese elite capture. And, the Chinese use these big loans, to finance projects that were important politically to the Rajapaksas, didn't always make economic sense. There was a reason that other countries turned down the offer to develop the port at Hambantota. So I think this is an opportunity for President Wickremesinghe to show he's standing up for Sri Lankan sovereignty, that the country should not be a pawn in any geostrategic games. It should not be manipulated or corrupted by any foreign countries. So I think it's an opportunity to really get away from the pattern, unfortunately, that we have seen developing between China and Sri Lanka over the last 15 years. Like I said, in 2015, there seemed to be a slight shifting. But I think as time went on in that Sirisena Wickremesinghe government, that there was sort of a drifting back into China's camp, and perhaps because of the financial reliance on China. So this really is an opportunity to break that unhealthy pattern of dependency that had been started. China can play a role. It's willing to invest, but certainly not a good idea to become overly dependent on China and to allow the kind of non-transparency that happens. And that's why it's so important to see that China will become part of the solution to the crisis and work with the other creditors and the IMF in setting the ship straight in Sri Lanka.
Let me just add one little thing here, that one of the reasons that I think the Chinese are staying away from this for the time being is that there are more than 30 countries that are on the verge of, if not default, but economic crisis that they have funded. And so if you restructure your debt with one, it could have a domino effect, and they would be kept holding the bag. And so I think they're trying to hold a line with Sri Lanka, but at the same time, that's also sending a signal that Chinese reliance on China is not going to be the best economic sustainable way forward for many of these countries too.
Thank you. In the same realm, there's a question here from the audience about if there's any possibility that Sri Lanka could void or get out of the naval base agreement with China, and what that means for other countries that are thinking about or have been making similar arrangements with China.
Well, no, the short answer is I doubt it. The Chinese, have them over the proverbial barrel because they made a deal in exchange for $1 billion in debt relief to hand China the 99-year lease of the port. But again, I think this should be a lesson to other countries to not get yourself in that position in the first place. To not become financially vulnerable so that China can push forward with its strategic goals. There's been a lot of questions, that it's the wrong term to call it debt trap diplomacy. But I think, let's look at the outcome in Sri Lanka. It certainly looks, feels, smells like debt trap diplomacy to me. Maybe in other countries it's different, but in the case of Sri Lanka, it seems like a pretty clear-cut case with the Hamato deport issue. And again, that should be a sort of warning sign to other countries when they're accepting BRI investment, to demand transparency, to allow the time that's needed for the full feasibility studies. Make sure that the project makes sense for the communities that it's serving, that there are employment opportunities associated with it, and that it is sustainable over the long term, that it's a sustainable project.
And of course, Lisa, they're going to be going ahead with the Port City project, which they're touting it as Sri Lanka going to be the next Dubai, the kind of financial mecca. But there is just such a lot of question marks on that, and talk about Sri Lankan sovereignty, because there's a lot of question about who exactly controls that 116 hectare of land that they're building as a port city. Who has the final say in that? They've been very cagey about who has the final say, whether the Chinese have a certain amount of authority there that would cut into Sri Lankan sovereignty and so on. I think those questions are now going to be asked more and more by not just creditors, but also by the population, by the protesters. And as you pointed out, their protests included, the Chinese white elephants. What you don't want to happen is a situation where the population says a pox on both houses kind of thing, that if India, if the US has to be extra, I think, vigilant about the kind of transparency and accountability and above board that the others are doing, and not to fall into the same temptations.
Unfortunately, I think that will have to be our last question. I want to say thank you so much to Lisa and Deepa for joining us today. We know you have a busy schedule, and we're very appreciative of you taking the time to share your expertise. We'd also like to present the opportunity to everyone tuning in with interest in US-Asia relations to reach out if they have any questions relevant to future events or this webinar. You can email us at usai@usasiainstitute.org, and we'd be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues discussed today. For our congressional staff in the audience, please keep a lookout for our upcoming Congressional 101 briefing series in the fall. And thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you